So that's kind of a funny way of putting it, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of mocking the Israelites, like,
Mm.
man, the land needs a rest from you guys because you're so awful.
Yes, exactly what it's saying. And the Cyrus cylinder is an archaeological artifact we found, another edict from Cyrus, where he is sending people back to all different cities. Here's a translation from James B. Pritchard's book. I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. And he's sending them back to their cities and saying, okay, yeah, sorry, I took you out of your city. You can go back to your original city and set your stuff back up there. And so he basically does the same thing for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we're continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? Today, we're going to be looking at the book of Ezra in the Old Testament, and we're going to explore the return of the Israelites to Jerusalem. And in the New Testament, we're going to talk about reconciliation with God. So last episode, we talked about what if you had lived your whole life and you hadn't been brought up in a Christian home and you had no basis for a relationship with God your whole life, and now you're trying to figure that out. And so we talked last week about that and how you could be reformed and return to God that way. And now we're looking at, well, what happens if you have been faithful and you completely fall away and your relationship with God is in tatters and you want to restore that relationship? And that's what we're going to see happening in the book of Ezra, which details a situation just like that, where the people have been taken into captivity because they were unfaithful to God. And now they're at a point where they're ready to come back to Jerusalem and restore the relationship with him there. So, Caleb, you're the historian. So why weren't the people in Jerusalem in the first place?
Well, we talked about King Josiah in the last episode and how he found the law and tried to restore Israel to God. But after his death, things quickly fell apart in Israel. There were several more kings who were not good, like Josiah, and there was a lot of foreign involvement, intervention. There were attacks and corruption, in league with other foreign leaders. So first they were attacked by the Egyptians.
Yeah, so Josiah died in like 609 BC. So that's kind of the time frame we're talking about. And in 2 Chronicles 36, verses 1 through 4, it says, "And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and made him king in Jerusalem in place of his father. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. The king of Egypt dethroned him in Jerusalem and imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. The king of Egypt made Eliakim, the brother of Jehoahaz, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But Necho took Eliakim's brother Jehoahaz and carried him off to Egypt." So,
Almost like he was waiting on Josiah to die to try to test Israel's strength, because it's only 3 months into the reign.
yeah, well, in fact, we didn't cover this, but the reason Josiah died was because he went chasing off after him. And he was like, "Hey, don't chase me. I don't have any fight with you." And Josiah chases him down anyway, and he ends up getting killed. So,
Mm.
um, so yeah, but he sort of had the upper hand over Judah at the time, because he had basically was responsible for Josiah's death. And then he comes back and says, "Yeah, and I don't want this guy to be king." So it's kind of
Yeah.
weird. We don't see stuff like that, much these days. Like where it'd be like if the president died in office or something, and some other countries came in and said, "Yeah, well, we didn't like that guy anyway, and we don't like the guy you replaced him with. So here's a new president for you."
Well, we don't see it in our country.
Yeah,
It happens all over the place.
yeah, that's true. So that's what's going on. The same kinds of intrigues are happening in Judah at the time, and that's how these first two kings after Josiah, that's how things go with them. And so then what happens?
So then they get attacked by the Babylonians, and they're already in a weakened position, as you can imagine.
Yeah, so it says here that Jehoiakim, and this is in 2 Chronicles 36, 5 through 8. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, attacked him and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also took to Babylon articles from the temple of the Lord and put them in his temple there. The other events of Jehoiakim's reign, the detestable things he did, and all that was found against him, are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, and Jehoiachin, his son, succeeded him as king. So,
Yeah. So they still have a king. There's still a kingdom, but once again, the king has been deposed and a relative's been put in his place. And
Mhm.
that's, he's basically going to be like a puppet ruler.
And not much of a puppet because he doesn't reign very long, as we'll see, because the Babylonians aren't done with their changes yet.
Yeah.
So in 2 Chronicles 36, 9 and 10, it says, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months and 10 days. That's a pretty specific number. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In the spring, King Nebuchadnezzar sent for him and brought him to Babylon, together with articles of value from the temple of the Lord, and he made Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, king over Judah and Jerusalem.
Yeah. So they're just completely at the mercy of these foreign powers. They can just come in and make or break a ruler at will.
Yeah. And so what's significant about Zedekiah becoming king of Judah, Caleb?
Uh, because he'll be the last king of Judah.
Yeah.
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 Not that, he's not really much of a king because he has no real authority of his own.
Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of similar to like King Herod in the Gospels. He's just like a puppet that Rome allows the Jews to have.
Yeah, it's just like, well, I'm in their family, so I get to be king. But
Hmm. So in 2 Chronicles 36, 11 through 14, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God and did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke the word of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him take an oath in God's name. He became stiff-necked and hardened his heart and would not turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem.
So yeah, the joke was sort of on Nebuchadnezzar there because he made Zedekiah promise in the name of his own God, Zedekiah promise in the name of your God that you're going to do everything you say. Oh yeah, I will. Not realizing
So,
that
yeah, the last guy that Zedekiah cares about.
yeah, not realizing how unfaithful that the capacity that the people in Judah had to be unfaithful to their own king. So anyway, so that didn't work out for Nebuchadnezzar or Zedekiah because Nebuchadnezzar's like, man, now I got to go back to Palestine. Last place he wanted to go, I'm sure. And so
Yeah.
he has to go in and wipe out the city now.
So in 587 BC, God uses Nebuchadnezzar to do just that. 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 19 tell us, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there.
So that's a pretty good summary, actually. Second Chronicles has a nice, succinct one. There's tons of material in the Bible, and there's tons of extra biblical materials from the Chronicles of the Babylonian Kings and other sources that you can go to if you want to really study this in depth. There's really a lot of good information out there from the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah being another resource. The prophet Jeremiah, reading his book and getting a lot of information about what's going on, the intrigues that are taking place in the scenes behind the scenes. So yeah, definitely encourage you. This is a time when you want to do your homework. We just cannot spend enough time to go into the depth it would take to cover every detail. But maybe we'll have a Bible scholars session when we're talking about some of the archaeology to support the book of Jeremiah and also the destruction of Jerusalem. It's a pretty fascinating topic.
Yeah. So both Judah and Israel are now in captivity. I think earlier I accidentally referred to it as Israel, which is really easy to do when we were talking about Josiah. But that's the kingdom of Judah.
So here's a final commentary in Second Chronicles that's, I think, really telling about what is going on here. It says in chapter 36, verses 20 through 21. So this is Nebuchadnezzar it's talking about. It says, "He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the king of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah."
So that's kind of a funny way of putting it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of mocking the Israelites like, man, the land needs a rest from you guys because you're so awful.
Yes, exactly what it's saying. And, they wouldn't do it voluntarily. So, God takes them out of the land so it gets its rest. It's kind of like the Philippians 2 that we read a few weeks ago, where it talks about every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Christ is Lord. Well, you'll either do that voluntarily
Yeah.
or, your knee will be bent to Christ on that day. But yeah, this is the same thing happening here. God's like, hey, I said the land gets a Sabbath, and, the people weren't doing it. And so he gives it
Yeah,
to
one
it.
way or another.
Yeah. So all of this sets the stage for the book of Ezra. Because what the book of Ezra is following those 70 years when the Persians do take over the Babylonian Empire. You see this scene that's discussed in the book of Ezra. And it opens with an account of Cyrus, the king of Persia, freeing all the captives of Judah to go back and rebuild the temple. So Ezra 1, verses 1 through 4. Do you want to read that?
Sure. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm, and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem."
So this is a really cool a detail where the Bible has this account of a edict that Cyrus published, telling that the people could go back and rebuild their temple. And so one really neat thing about it is that there's also an object called the Cyrus cylinder, which I'll put on the screen here for people who are watching the video format. And the Cyrus cylinder is an archaeological artifact we found, another edict from Cyrus, where he is sending people back to all different cities across the Tigris, which would be in the same direction as Jerusalem. And so we'll go ahead and read this. This is a translation of what's on the Cyrus cylinder, written in cuneiform writing, and so it's not something anybody these days reads much. But here's a translation from James B. Pritchard's book, Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament, from page 316. It says, I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great Lord, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus has brought up to Babylon to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which make them happy. May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities ask daily Bel and Nebo for a long life for me, and may they recommend me to him. So you see, this isn't exactly the same edict that was mentioned in the Bible, but it's a very similar one in which he's freeing captives that have been brought in by former kingdoms or rulers of the kingdom, and he's sending them back to their cities and saying, okay, yeah, sorry, I took you out of your city. You can go back to your original city and set your stuff back up there. And so he basically does the same thing for the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Marduk is a Sumerian god, so that's a neighbor of Israel, and this is known. I mean, there are other examples in history as well, which we won't get into. But the Persians were known to be relatively tolerant of different religions and different people within the empire, and the general consensus is that they were probably kinder masters than the Babylonians were. And he mentions here of Babylon, he's kind of undoing what Babylon did by taking everything out of the temples. He goes and restores those religions.
Yeah, some people point at the Cyrus cylinder and call it sort of the original Bill of Rights, where Cyrus is saying that everybody should have some basic rights, and the government shouldn't usurp those. So it's kind of like a freedom of religion clause here.
Yeah, that's a better way to think of it, I think. But I also think there's something interesting in the Chronicles version, which it does not appear in the Cyrus cylinder, but where he says that the inhabitants of the localities where the Jews are should provide silver and gold for them to go and readorn the temple.
Yeah, well, we're going to see a lot of those details as we look at what happens when they try to rebuild.
Yeah, but do you know what that reminds me of?
What's that?
In the Bible is the Exodus. That people of Egypt were moved to gift the Israelites with finery and supplies just to get them out of there.
Yeah, the same. Yeah, this really is actually, if you read through the entire story, all the different accounts, there is a lot of talk to that end, that the people felt disposed to give them things as they returned. All right, so that's a lot of background information. The bottom line is that Cyrus let the people go back to Jerusalem with his blessing to rebuild. And so we see that happening in Ezra 1, verses 5 through 11. And this goes along with what you were just saying, Caleb. Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuable gifts, in addition to all the freewill offerings. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and had placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought by Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So here's a little list, just so you can get an idea of, this is from the Bible, of the things that were sent. This was the inventory. Gold dishes, 30. Silver dishes, 1,000. Silver pans, 29. Gold bowls, 30. Matching silver bowls, 410. Other articles, 1,000. In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and silver. Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's a shame they couldn't find one more silver pan, to make it a nice 30.
Yeah, that would have been nice.
But the Sheshbazzar and the officials mentioned there, this is more historical context that makes sense with what we know of Persia, that they were well organized. They kept careful records. I mean, that's why we can see the letters, and we'll see more about that later in the story. But these are Sheshbazzar is like you know, a governor, an official who
Mhm.
answers. He reports to Cyrus on
Yeah.
what's going on in an area which includes Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting to maybe talk about, do we still see God working this way today? Do we think of it that way? Because we see here he's orchestrating world events. He's working through world leaders to accomplish his ends. Whether that end is to take the people from Judah into captivity, or whether with through Nebuchadnezzar, or whether it's to bring them back out of captivity, like he does with Cyrus, king of Persia. So, what do you think, Caleb, on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think God always works through not only world leaders but ordinary people too. I mean, like we've seen in
Yeah,
some of the stories, like what Jael is a good example. Just like a random woman who kills a general when he's fleeing a battle. It's not always the generals and kings and presidents and those types of people who are always the movers of history. God works through all of us.
and that's a good point to bring up. Is that really even the people who make all the big moves in history are really just ordinary people anyway? That's kind of what you learn from like the episode on humility.
Yeah,
And so anybody who loses sight of the fact that they're just a normal person always seems to end up going the wrong direction.
yeah.
So, well, remember that these details that we're talking about, some of them were specified in prophecies by people like Jeremiah. So let's, um, without going into too much content from Jeremiah, I just wanted to give one prophecy that he had from Jeremiah 29 verses 10 through 14. It says, "This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile."
So
So,
there's like a probably the most common bumper sticker verse or you know little wall decor verse that you see in somebody's living room. There
mhm,
is, I know the plans I have for you to prosper and not to harm you, to give you hope in the future. But
mhm.
the context there is a promise to the whole nation of Israel, right? To the whole seed of Abraham,
Yeah.
and specifically here, uh, he's bringing them out of exile where they've been banished for 70 years. There's kind of an echo even of to continue making relations to the Exodus story. Uh, there's an echo of the 40 years of wandering in the desert.
Mhm,
Like 70 years. By this point, everyone who came out, almost everyone will have died,
mhm.
and now they're getting to go back. So the context of that promise is interesting because it's really easy for people to just take that verse or any verse out of context, and for this verse to just apply it to me. Well, God wants to prosper me and give me hope in the future and health and wealth in this life, and that's certainly not what it's about. Because if you keep reading, the whole point of the plan that He has is for the people to call on Him and pray to Him, and for Him to answer them when they seek Him with all their heart. So He's wanting to restore the relationship.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it speaks to, what's the point of suffering? We haven't had a discussion
Hmm.
of like theodicy or anything like that on the podcast yet. But part of what God's saying here is, well, do you think I took you into captivity for no reason? I mean, he's saying, this is all part of a plan. Like, this is what's best for you.
Hmm.
I mean, you have to go into captivity because and nothing else I've tried is getting through to you. I'm not giving up on you. I have another plan. The plan involves you going into captivity and then coming back out after a set period of time. And so the fact that everything was foretold was to help the people see the goodness of what God was doing for them, even though it seemed hard at the time.
Yeah, that's right. Not
So
that there's no application to us today, but it's probably more focused on our relationship with God than things we can get in our life.
yeah,
And it also is more of a group promise, I think, because the church is the continuation of Abraham's seed. So
yeah. Well, and we'll see. There's like as we often see, there's even greater promises than these offered later on in the Bible.
yeah.
So
So they get back to Jerusalem, and the first thing they do is rebuild the altar.
yes. So in Ezra 3 verses 1 through 6, it says, "When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the festival of tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid." So the first thing they wanted to do is reestablish the altar and get sacrifices going.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it mentions the fear of the people, right?
Yeah, so
Just like they were afraid of the Canaanites when they first came there.
that's a good tie-in. Yeah, the fear the spies had of the people said, "Oh, that's too big a land. The people there are huge. We can't possibly take it." That's an interesting tie-in. I guess. Yeah, what I thought is interesting about the fear is this is the first negative thing you see. Like everything's Cyrus says go back. Everybody's
Hmm.
giving them stuff, and then you realize, well, wait, it's not going as well as maybe it was, and it's because of the people around them.
Yeah.
And so now we're gonna start to see what is going on with the people around them, and this may be something that is helpful to you as you think about this restoration that we're talking about here, and when you think about it in your own life, what is it that when you try to make a change in your life, sometimes the people around you are like, "Hey, what are you doing? Why are you changing?"
Yeah.
But you have to fight against that sometimes. The people are like, "Why aren't you still running around with us and doing the things we used to do?" And maybe you've made some decisions that you want to change some things in your life, and people are calling you back to the old ways. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just kind of something to think about the analogy.
That makes sense. I mean, these are the people who drew them away from God when they were living in the land before, That's why Zedekiah swearing an oath in God's name didn't mean anything.
Yeah, that's true. So then let's look at what happens next. So they begin rebuilding the temple, right? And then in Ezra 3, 7 through 13, it says, "Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia." So that's kind of interesting. That's the same way Solomon went about
Yeah.
building the
Going
temple.
from Tyre,
Yeah.
getting the Phoenicians to supply it.
In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the people, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work. They appointed Levites 20 years old and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Joshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad, and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord, He is good, His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. So,
Yeah, that's such an interesting juxtaposition. The joy and the weeping,
and what was the reason?
because they remembered the old temple. Those were
Yeah.
the oldest people among them. I mean, they would have had to be really old
Mm-hmm.
because they've been out for 70 years. So
Yes.
they have to be like 80-year-olds. That's
Mhm.
kind. I mean, it makes sense. If you're 80 years old and you hadn't seen something since you were a child,
Yeah.
there's a really strong emotional feel there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've survived a lot in your life too.
Yeah, and they've been through a lot of hardship as well. So coming back to what they should have been doing in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's the situation. They're starting to rebuild. And then this opposition occurs, and it's during the reign of Cyrus. So let's look at this and see who these people are that are opposing them. So you want to read Ezra 4, 1 through 5?
Yeah, I can. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia.
So I think it's interesting because the people, the appeal that they make to them, people surrounding them, is, "Oh, you should let us help you because we've been doing this ever since Esarhaddon was king." And they name like a foreign king,
Yeah.
like right in their plea. And so it's like, I don't think so. You're not Jewish
Well,
people.
if you had been really seeking God, then there would be a temple there.
Yeah.
The people who are wanting to see God are the ones trying to rebuild the temple to do it properly.
Yeah. And so they basically they say we were people who were planted here by foreign kings.
Yeah,
And so they're like, no.
that's who supplanted the Israelites.
Yes.
Yeah,
So this is the people that supplanted them. So now let's keep on reading and see what else we can learn, because then during the reigns of Xerxes and Artaxerxes, there's some more opposition. So in Ezra,
well, and note that they're going to change strategies. Cyrus had given the command, so they can't really appeal to him or go against him. They just have to try to coerce the Israelites. But now that there's new kings, they're going to try a different tack.
yeah, and it's pretty good one. So in Ezra 4, 6 through 10, it says, "At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabiel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script in the Aramaic language. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great honorable Ashurbanipal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates." Okay, so
again, we're looking at how the foreign powers came in and we're just moving people around. They can make and break kings, and they can move populations at will. So these are the officials of the Persian king who are over the hodgepodge now that dwells in the whole area of the Promised Land
Mhm.
and the nearby regions.
And in specifically, one place is mentioned there that's important to our understanding of the New Testament
Yeah.
too, is Samaria. Because by the time we get to the New Testament, we realize that there's a lot of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews.
Mhm.
And we're going to see here kind of the seeds of that and what made that such a deep animosity. So at least some of these people were Samaritans.
Right.
Um,
And remember, that was the capital of the kingdom of Israel,
Previously,
right?
yes.
Where
Mhm.
Jerusalem was the capital of Judah.
Yep. And
So
then,
there's already a history of division there.
yeah.
And now maybe there is some truth to the claim that some people were making that they had been trying to worship God, right? Because we know the Samaritans had a sort of offshoot Jewish religion.
Yes. And so this is kind of like we're seeing the tension here between the true Judaism and this, I guess, hybrid.
Yeah.
So here's what the letter says. Okay, in Ezra 4:11 through 16. That was just the people who wrote it that we read a minute ago, just to establish that some of them were Samaritans. So the letter says, "This is a copy of the letter they sent him to King Artaxerxes from the servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That is why this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans Euphrates."
And by the way, they keep saying trans Euphrates. That just that means across the Euphrates. So
Yeah.
Persia's over in the east. From their perspective, Israel and the surrounding lands are across the Euphrates. And by the way, they're exactly right. Because
Yeah.
why was the city destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar? Because Zedekiah had rebelled against him after
Mhm.
swearing an oath. So Nebuchadnezzar came in, said, "Guess what? No more king, no more walls, no more temple. Everything's burned." And they're correct in this claim that the city was destroyed because it was rebellious.
Yeah. And so you see here that they were working on the walls, and that's something we usually think about in the book of Nehemiah, which is the next book in the Old
Hmm.
Testament. But they were working on the walls already at the time they were rebuilding the temple. And so the people in the surrounding area were saying, don't let them fortify this city, or they're going to have the same problems they had before. And so it's interesting, rather than appealing or even mentioning that Cyrus had said anything about rebuilding Jerusalem, they just say, go back and check out the history of the
Yeah.
city.
Well, that's why they knew they needed to wait for a new king.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's so underhanded. I mean, I feel like you can see even the king hearing this message would have to see that they're trying to kiss his boot.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
where they're like, "Oh, no, we're under obligation to the palace, and we would never want to see the king dishonored." And he's like, "Yeah, I mean, you guys are kind of in the same boat as, as the Israelites. You've been displaced and under foreign rule for a long time. So why? What's your angle here?"
Well, when you listen to this letter, then you can begin to see why was there so much animosity for the Samaritans by the time you get to the New Testament,
Yeah,
and that because they wrote letters like this to try to stop them from rebuilding the town. So the king's response is pretty interesting in Ezra 4:17 through 22. You want to read that?
yeah. The king sent this reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests?
So now it's pretty obvious why they hate the Samaritans.
Yeah. Well, and like I said earlier, we do know that the Persians kept careful records of everything. They had a strong legal system and bureaucracy, and that's being perfectly, played out here in the biblical narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at the result of this edict that came out. In Ezra 4:23-24, it says, as soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So they compelled them by force, right?
Yeah.
So now it's not just bad feelings toward each other, but it's actually come to fisticuffs here.
Yeah. The sneaky approach didn't work. Trying to ingratiate yourselves with them didn't work, and then they had to go to King Artaxerxes. They couldn't have gone to Cyrus, so they finally found a way to do it, and they forced him to stop.
Yeah, and so the work was stopped for the rest of the reign of Artaxerxes. I mean, at least this Artaxerxes. It's hard to keep track of which kings are which.
Yeah. So this conflict between the rebuilding and the opposition of it carries on into the reign of the next king, which is Darius, and we've been through, I think, 4 different kings here: Cyrus, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and Darius now. And you'll recognize Darius probably from the book of Daniel, because he's good buddies with Daniel.
Yeah, we're going to read some of that here in a minute.
Yeah.
But so in Ezra 5:1-5, it says, now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. At that time, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates went to them and asked, who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it? They also asked, what are the names of those who are constructing this building? But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply be received. So
notice there's a different governor now. The Balthazar guy is gone. So the Jews might be being a little sneaky here as well, waiting until there's a new guy in charge to start rebuilding. And now they've got, God is with them. The prophets are with them. So like that promise that we saw in Jeremiah, right? That God has a plan for them to prosper them, and not just for whatever they want to be prospered with, but specifically so that they'll seek Him with all their heart, that they'll turn to Him in prayer and He'll answer them. And that seems to be what's happening here, even before the temple has finished being rebuilt.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting. They're asking all these questions, like we talked about a minute ago, was happening earlier, and this time they're like taking names, like what are the names of those who are constructing this building, and who authorized you to do that? And
that's like if you were when you work customer service, if there's a customer who's angry and they're like, "What's your name?"
Yeah, and it's kind of trying to take the anonymity out of it too. Like, I guess when we were talking about when you're trying to make a change in your own life, you may have friends go, "Come on, I know what you're not really like this. You do these other things. I know all the things you do," and they try to drag you back into it. But like in this case, they're kind of like, "Oh, we're going to turn your name in. We know what you've done." So, but the interesting thing in verse 5 is that it says the eye of God was watching and was watching over everything. And it reminded me an echo of Genesis 1:2, where everything was dark and bleak and dismal, but the Spirit of God was hovering over. This is another one of this is another one of those dark, empty places, right? Which,
Yeah, it seems like everybody's against him.
yeah, how's this ever going to work out? But oh wait, Spirit of God's there. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
I wonder what's going to happen.
I just wanted to point out as well, we talked earlier about God working through, um, world rulers and such. I think the enemy certainly works through those as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been seeing that happening here as they're all manipulating each other. Kind of this chess game going on.
Yeah, well, this time the
I think what tips the balance though is that God always remembers the pawns. He thinks to work through the little people, and the enemy tends to just think big.
Well, this time though, the opponents of Israel asked the wrong question, right? Like, and I don't know if the Jews, sort of like tricked them into asking this question or what, but they told them, well, we're acting on the wishes of Cyrus to build this temple. And so they said, "Oh, really? Well, we'll find out about that." So so that the letter that they send, instead of saying, "Check out how evil Jerusalem has been over the years," they say, "These guys claim that Cyrus told them they could do this, right?" So in Ezra 5,
I thought it was the Jews who made the request. It wasn't the Jews. It was the neighboring peoples.
It's the neighboring peoples.
Okay, I misread it.
Tatnai sends the letter.
Oh yeah. Okay.
In verse 17, it says, "Now, if it pleases the king, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter." So, and they're asking this of Darius, right? And so, as Caleb mentioned earlier, right, Darius is a guy who is kind of favorable toward Daniel and Daniel's God.
Yeah.
Because of what happened with the lion's den. And so real quickly, let's read that just to get that background, but it's in Daniel 6, verses 19 through 24. You want to read that?
Sure. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones.
Well, that's...
Ouch.
Yeah, that's a powerful...
That's not the way I want to go.
Turn of events there. Well, so that's kind of the same kind of jujitsu that's happening here with the Jews and the people around them. They trick them into asking
each other, and
ask this question. Ask him if Cyrus really did give this edict. And so,
but the Daniel story continues though.
Yeah.
So here's what King Darius, his reaction to the outcome in Daniel 6:25 through 28. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. As at this point, he's ruling most of the known world at that point. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. There's that prosper language again.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Maybe he knew Jeremiah too.
So that's the guy that they want to ask to help them, snub the Jews.
Yeah. So in this context, right, that's the opponents of Israel. They asked their question, and so this is what happened. Darius found the decree of Cyrus, and he issued his own memorandum. And just to kind of briefly sum it up, without reading everything, in Ezra 6, 6 and 7, it says, "Now then, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and you other officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site." And so pretty much a smackdown right there of like, hey, stop doing any opposition to this work. But then
Yeah, even more. Not just can they not oppose it.
Yeah, but then in verse 8 it says, "Moreover, I hereby decree that you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God, or what you are to do. Their expenses are to be paid fully out of the royal treasury from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop." So your
And
tax dollars at work.
you got to bankroll it now.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we can get into this more later, especially in like the book of Esther. There's a really strong example of this, but more about just the historicity of this surrounding Persia. We know that the way that the Persian Empire's law worked at this point was that a law was not repealed. So their laws, when the king issued a decree, it had to be followed through. He couldn't just change his mind on it.
Mm.
So and we can see more how that plays out in Esther. A lot of times the laws would be deliberately have like an expiration date or something like that, so they don't get stuck with something,
Forever.
for all eternity. But when he finds this decree of Cyrus, that's pretty much it. There's nothing
Yeah.
they can do about it. So they just proved themselves wrong with the strongest authority in the land.
Well, and then not only do they have to pay for it with their own taxes, but then it says in verses 11 and 12, "Furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they are to be impaled on it.
Ouch.
And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence." So,
He's not mincing words.
no. So they asked the wrong guy the wrong question, and they got the answer that they probably didn't want, but the Jews were elated
Yeah,
with.
well, they're going to build their house, and if you don't like it, we'll destroy your house and kill you.
Yeah. So again, we see here where God is orchestrating like world events and the actions of world leaders to accomplish His will,
Hmm.
and to make sure that this particular work continues, this work of restoration. And so, what was the result? So in Ezra 6:13 through 15, it says, "Then because of the decree of King Darius, or because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the third day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius." So I think that would have been about 4 years, based on it had been the 2nd year of Darius, I think, when the letter
Yeah.
was sent.
Well, they had already spent years working on it before.
Yeah. But that's still a lot faster than Solomon did it. So, and then there were some great celebrations. They had feasts. They had a Passover celebration. And then the rest of the book of Ezra kind of talks about purity of marriage, not intermarrying with the people, and talks about how a large number of exiles were returned to Jerusalem after it was restored. And so there's a lot to read there. We've covered it as in a lot of depth. So
Yeah,
I
we've probably
think
spent more time in the Old Testament here than in
on
any other episode.
thing we've done. Yeah. So the Old Testament takeaway, right, is that God will do whatever it takes to restore His people.
Yeah.
Right.
Even having an emperor impale people on their own house.
And beams out of their house. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He'll orchestrate world events. He'll orchestrate the actions of world leaders. He'll do that to punish His own people when they need it.
Right. Yeah.
And he'll do that to bring them back and restore them when it's time. And so God will do the same thing for you is the point, even though, Caleb was kind of making fun of, the bumper sticker mentality, but really the promises that we have in our lives for restoration with God are the same as it was for these people in ancient Israel. So
Yeah, Yeah, I like the verse. It's a good verse. I just think that people don't don't understand the depth behind it. You know, we put it on the wall of our living room in our nice middle class houses, and or on our the back of our SUV, and we're like, "See, God's prospering me." And
Oh, yeah, sure. It's not about health and wealth
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. But it is about if there's no dark, empty place you can find yourself in that God can't turn into something more
yes,
beautiful than
yeah,
you could imagine, right? It's about restoring the relationship.
right. And
Yeah.
and if you are the problem, right? You know that there's that classic line, it's not me, it's not you, it's me. I'm the problem, right? It's like a lousy breakup line. But if you're the problem in the relationship with God, well, he he wants to be in a relationship with you still. So that punishment that comes on the Israelites, right, when they're just completely rejecting him. The only purpose he served was for Zedekiah to get Nebuchadnezzar off his back by swearing an oath in God's name, which he intended to break. So
Yeah.
if that's the state that it's come to, then well, the only way God can take you from there to a relationship with him is going to be through some breaking down and some hardship.
Yeah.
You've got to be humbled first.
Well, and so when we talk about restoration, what does the New Testament have to say about that? Because remember, the name of our series is "Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him?" And so we've been talking about Ezra for an hour, obviously. But let's get to the New Testament because we got at least one lengthy passage that we want to read and try to talk about the New Testament implications of this. So, what did Jesus teach about God's willingness to restore us when we go astray? And I think the most famous example of that is the parable of the lost son,
That's
right?
right.
So you want to
Yeah,
you want
I
to
can read
start
that.
reading that?
This is Luke 15:11 through 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So when you read that in the context of what we just read in Ezra, it almost sounds like it was tailor made for that story.
It does. It does. Like, was the younger son's name Zedekiah?
Yeah. Just spit in God's face, and surprisingly, it seems like he gives you what you want. But the trick is that he knows that what you want is terrible for you and will destroy you.
Mm,
And he's hoping that you'll come to repentance before you're destroyed, so he can restore you.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you think about like it's so similar to the favor of the kings in Ezra. Like you don't necessarily expect these foreign kings to be favorable, toward the people of Judah, but they do. They give them these edicts. Go back and rebuild. You can have all the tax money you want, and all these things. I want to help. I want to try to make the rebuilding go fast and smooth. And you would think that they would be opposed to it, and that's kind of the same thought that the younger son has when he's returning home. He's like, man, my dad is not going to be happy to see me.
Yeah.
And instead, he's like waiting for him, because this dad in the story, he has plans to prosper his son, not to harm him, right?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of like that. That's why we take all the power out of the bumper sticker,
Yeah.
because we're like, oh, well, you have plans to give me a Lexus. No, that's not, I have plans that when you're stupid, I'm not going to reject you completely.
Yeah.
I'm going to still be seeking your good.
Well, it's just like, I think I brought this up in the last episode, or maybe the one before that, about the vine, right? When Christ says in John, I'm the vine, I'm the true vine, and you are the branches. And I think most of the time when I hear it quoted, the third person is left out because the Father, he says, my Father is the vine dresser, or the husbandman, or depending on what translation you're reading. The point is, he's the one that prunes. And he talks about the branches that give no fruit. He tears them off and throws them away, and the ones that do, he prunes so they can give better fruit.
Yeah.
And it's exactly like that. Like if you're the problem in your relationship with God, and God's never the problem. But if we're in a position where we are just selfish, right? I mean, the people who misuse that quote, that Jeremiah verse, are thinking like the younger son, right? They're like, give me my inheritance and let me go my way. And if you're in that position with where that's how you're treating God, then the best thing he can do is prune, right? Is to let you go through a time of tribulation, captivity to Babylon, so to speak.
Yeah, and that was why, it was said, well, look, there was the prophecy. I mean, I'm doing this as part of my plan. I have plans for you, and they're plans for the good, not the bad. So,
right.
And this parable
that comes before, that prophecy comes before the downfall of Jerusalem. So part of those plans for prospering them is having the entire city burnt and destroyed, and them all being carted off into captivity.
Well, and he tells Jeremiah in the book of Jeremiah, go out and buy a field because you're coming back here, things like that. So I think, don't ever think God's given up on you. We're talking about, restoring yourself back to, faithful walk with God. No matter what ruinous path you've been on, he is keeping your old path for you. He's be happy for you to return and to be restored.
Yeah, I also think the way the son comes home, he's sad. He's like the 80-year-old men we talked about who came back weeping.
Oh, that's a great
to Jerusalem.
Analogy.
But the father is joyful, like the people who had never seen the temple.
Yes, that is an amazing insight, Caleb. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
He's just focused on the relationship, right? Like the people were happy to have the relationship back with God, but the older men who could remember how decrepit the relationship was before are still weeping over that.
Yeah, I mean, that brings in different layers of it there.
And then the brother is, like the people who were living there, the remnant who were in the land, who don't want to have anything to do with them. They don't want to see them back.
Well, I have read, where people say, okay, everybody assumes that the reason that the old people were weeping is because the new one's not anywhere near as good as the previous one. And then the other reason they could be weeping is because they know it was destroyed because of what we're like, and we're probably still the same, same.
I think it's definitely that.
It's having to be rebuilt because of us. But it probably wasn't as grand as Solomon's was, because Solomon was one of the richest guys in the world, and these guys are, trying to live on other people's tax dollars, which, so anyway.
I don't know why they weren't more popular. Yeah.
But the point of this parable, though, that of course everybody takes away from it is that the son doesn't expect to be welcome. Nobody expects the son to be welcome. And then the twist of the story is the father welcomes the son back. and even the older brother doesn't like it. And so I think most people expect God don't, or most people don't expect God to be favorably disposed toward them when they've gone astray, right? We don't expect him to be favorably disposed toward us when we know what we're like. But surprise, God is favorably disposed towards you.
That's right. Even when it feels like he's not, like he's punishing you, that punishment is actually
Mm,
part of the plan, right?
yeah. Yes. I mean, I've had in men's ministry, we've had grown men, who struggle with habitual sin and they can't get over it and they feel terrible because, they come in, I don't know why. I know I feel so bad about it, but I still keep doing it. And I tell them, well, I mean, it's good that you feel bad about it. That's evidence that the Holy Spirit is calling you with your conscience, to stop. The fact that you still feel bad about it means that the Spirit's working in your life. If you didn't feel bad about it, that would be when I would really be worried about it,
Yeah.
you know. And so in
Yeah.
this case, it's a sign that God's still working on you, still involved in your life, and those old paths that you might have forsaken are still there for you to walk in. He wants you to continue and pick them back up and walk right in them, just like the younger son when he came home.
Yeah. I think that, his willingness to come back as a slave, as a servant of his father, that he's not worthy to be his son anymore,
Hmm.
right? Like you were saying, maybe the old men were weeping because the new temple was not as glorious as the old. Well, I don't think they cared, right? I'd rather worship God well in like a rotting shack
Yeah.
than be a corrupt and uh, idolatrous heathen in a beautiful marble temple.
It's such a deep parable. There's so many things we could say about it. We could do another hour just on it. But we're just trying to make the connection with this book of Ezra and say, when it comes to restoration, God's on your side. He's orchestrating things for you. He's actively planning for you, and he's actually looking for you to return, just like this father was when his son was still a far way off. He was watching for him and ran out to meet him.
Mhm.
So don't give in to the lie of, your opposition or other people, like in the story of Ezra. Well, you shouldn't be doing this. You're a troublemaker and all this. Whatever it is God's put on your heart to do, then do it with His help. All right, so jumping over to 2 Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. You want to read that for us?
Yeah. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
So beautiful, beautiful passage about being restored, being reconciled to God. And I love that it starts with this, your viewpoint, this worldly point of view versus a spiritual point of view, I'll say,
Yeah.
because, we just had a few weeks ago our session on spiritual vision versus spiritual blindness. And this is another example of that, like, why is it that when everybody hears the story for the first time of the prodigal son, the lost son, that they think the father's not going to accept this guy back, right?
Yeah.
Why don't they see it spiritually, like this father really loves his son and he's going to be happy to have him back safe?
Yeah. Only a father who loved his wealth more than the son would would be more upset about losing the wealth to prostitutes, like the older brother complains about.
Yeah.
So that you can see what the older brother's trusting in, right?
Well, and also, yeah, the father was willing to give him half of his kingdom, basically, because he
Yeah.
asked for it.
And
So,
that's so interesting. The older brother appeals when he appeals to his father. He says, "Oh, he squandered your property on prostitutes." What did what did the Samaritans and the surrounding peoples appeal to was it Artaxerxes about? They said, if this place is rebuilt, then look at their history. They have a history of rebellion, and there will cease to be a flow of tax income from the
Yeah.
region if you allow
Yeah.
it to be rebuilt. It's
Yeah,
the same exact complaint
it is. You're
because
right.
they're only looking at the material wealth that the with earthly vision.
What I love about this Second Corinthians story is it ties it together in another way because it says, "Oh, you're ambassadors for this
Hmm.
story of reconciliation." So it's like if Cyrus had appointed, he told the governors, "Do everything you can to help us. Don't hinder it." Right? It's like he was telling them, "You guys, you go out and endorse this work and make sure it gets done." And
Yeah,
it says they did it diligently.
yeah, that's true.
And so that's our role now. We're the ones who have the truth as Christians of God's message that sins are forgiven through Christ, and He's committed that message of reconciliation to us. That God is the Father that wants you to come home. Don't run away from Him. Don't be shy about returning home. Come back to Him because He wants you back.
Yeah, he remember the point of the temple from our temple episode. The point of the temple was to be a place of joy for all of the world's people, right?
Hmm.
Not just the Jews, not just Christians, but all the world's people. Uh, so this is the temple going out to the world here in this verse. Like we are restored individually, so that we can become a part of the church is the temple now, right? And it has no national boundaries, so that we can go out and bring that joy and bring that restoration in Christ to all people.
Yeah, and the fact that there were people crying at the temple where it should have been a place of joy, seems out of place, right? Because we talked about the temple was meant to be a place of joy for all people, and even the people there when it was being rebuilt were crying. And it's like, well, it's not about the building, right? It's about the God that brought
Yeah,
you back there. And
right.
so, no matter what the temple looked like, there should have been joy, right? Because
Hmm.
you're back in the place God prescribed by His manipulation of world history and leaders, and there should have just been joy. It's like, who cares what it looks like?
Yeah, well, that's the point we made earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, this verse here, I think it actually pairs really well. It doesn't look like it on the surface, but it pairs really well with all the verses, all the New Testament verses we looked at before about being the temple of God.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you're the ambassador. You're the one who's out there, the mouthpiece. You're the center of attention, and bringing this message to people.
Right. So, and it says our sins are not counted against us either, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, which is
that's
that's an awesome promise.
that's nice, and also that you're a new creation, right? And
Yeah.
so, you know, what's holding you back from being restored to God? Are you hung up over all the things you've done? Remember, we talked about this in so many of our lessons, but all the way back to all the way to the first lesson, there's no dark, empty place you can be in that God can't turn it
Mhm.
around. And then in Exodus, He's saving you first, then He calls you to obedience. So stop getting hung up about all the things that you
Yeah.
did, like God will never accept me back. Yeah, He already died for you. And
Like the
then
Leviticus episode.
And
Man,
then, yeah,
that's
the
the atonement.
Leviticus, yeah, the atonement, right?
Man, every week it's like God is just supporting the podcast.
I know, I know. He's so gracious. He's got plans to prosper it.
Yeah.
But so anyway, all these lessons tie together, and this lesson in particular ties several things together, like Caleb said, and with the temple episode and others. So just allow yourself to be this new creation, and realize that God sees you as a brand new creation who's never sinned. He sees you as Christ who's never sinned.
Yeah, because remember, God keeps creating. Back from the very first episode, we looked at that. Christ is still sustaining all things and creating all things.
Mm, yes.
That's why He can't take the Sabbath off, like the Pharisees complain about. So, speaking of being a new creation, we always, if we can, we always like to end in Revelation, and this is a verse we've read before, probably in the creation episode. Revelation 21:5. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then He said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And like we saw in the Corinthians passage, we are being made new as well, right? We are restored as individuals. And then we're called to the ministry of reconciliation, that we can go out through Christ and help restore others.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So that gets us to our New Testament takeaway. You want to do that?
Sure. God is actively seeking reconciliation with you.
Yeah, so this ties together the Ezra passage and the lost son passage, and of course having reconciliation in the Second Corinthians passage. But you know, in Ezra, right, it talks about how God had plans to prosper you, not to harm you. When we were studying that, and we read the Jeremiah prophecy, and um, and then the fact that God is always seeking your welfare, right? Just like the father in that lost son story, running out to greet his son. And, you know, so it's like all these things tie together in this one idea that God is actively seeking reconciliation with you. He's got a plan and he's working it and he's watching for you to return.
Yeah. And even when it doesn't feel like it, right? Even the downturns were part of the plan, because remember that promise came before the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the
So
course
even
correction you need.
even the harshness, even when you've run away from God and squandered your wealth, like the prodigal son, and then you find yourself among the pigs. It's all to bring you to that point where he repents.
Yeah. I mean, God is actively seeking reconciliation, and our prayer for you is that you will seek reconciliation with God. And what are the first steps? What's the first step in reconciliation? You know?
Well, I would say repentance, I guess,
Yeah.
like I just said there.
Yeah. Well, we talked about repentance a couple weeks ago. Also, that the Greek word metanoia, changing your mind, and turning back toward God, and trusting in God's mercy and forgiveness. I think that's what you learn from these stories this week is you can trust God, and be confident in turning back to him, that he is going to be merciful and forgive and wants the best for you.
Mhm. That's all I got.
So just, our message to you this week is, feel welcome back into God's family. If you've wandered away, if you're having a bad week, whatever, just know that you're welcome back into the family through this reconciliation that you have with God. So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.